a young writer from the slums shares his heartfelt stories with the world. But when success knocks at his door, a shocking challenge threatens to destroy everything he's built. Pedro adjusted his apron and stacked the last crate of produce in the small neighborhood market where he worked. His hands were rough from long days of unloading boxes, but his mind often wandered beyond the confines of the shop. Every night, after clocking out and walking home through the narrow, bustling alleys of the favela, he found solace in a world of his own making, a world born from his words. The house he shared with his mother, Dona Marta, and his two younger siblings was modest but filled with warmth. The peeling paint on the walls didn't bother Pedro as much as the creak of the wooden chair he used at his makeshift writing desk in the corner of the room. That chair was his sanctuary. By the dim light of a desk lamp, he would sit, scribbling stories in a tattered notebook that had been a birthday gift years ago. The paper was running out, but his imagination was endless. That evening, as the sounds of samba and children's laughter floated through the open window, Pedro leaned over his desk. The faint aroma of bread from the nearby bakery mingled with the cool night air, grounding him in the present even as his mind traveled to the worlds he created. His characters, heroes and villains, lovers and dreamers, seemed to leap off the pages, and he wrote with an urgency that only he understood. He didn't write for recognition or money. He wrote because it was his escape. But deep down, buried beneath layers of modesty, was a dream he barely dared to acknowledge. What if his stories could reach people beyond the favela? What if his words could matter? "Pedro, dinner's ready." His mother called from the kitchen. Pedro placed his pen down reluctantly and joined his family at the small table. Dona Marta served a simple but hearty meal, her tired eyes lighting up as she talked about her day cleaning houses. "And you, Pedro?" she asked, noticing his distant expression. "What's on your mind?" "Nothing much," he said with a shrug, though his mind was still on the last scene he had written. The next day, on his way to work, something caught his eye. A flyer pinned to the school's bulletin board read, "Submit your stories for a chance to win. Open to all aspiring writers." Pedro stopped in his tracks. His heart raced as he read the details. The contest was online, free to enter, and offered a feature in a well-known literary blog for the winner. Could this be his chance? He tore off one of the tabs with a submission link and stuffed it into his pocket. The rest of the day was a blur. As he stacked shelves and served customers, his thoughts kept returning to the flyer. He imagined his story reaching readers beyond the neighborhood, perhaps even making his mother proud. But just as quickly, doubt crept in. Who would take a kid from the favela seriously? Would his stories, written on old paper and shaped by his modest life, be enough? That night, back at his desk, Pedro stared at the flyer. His siblings were asleep, and Dona Marta's soft humming from the kitchen provided a soothing backdrop. He hesitated, his pen hovering over the submission form he had printed earlier. "What's the worst that could happen?" he whispered to himself. With a deep breath, Pedro began copying his story onto the form, carefully typing out each word. By the time he hit submit, it was well past midnight, and exhaustion tugged at him. But for the first time in years, he felt a spark of hope. As he crawled into bed, the weight of possibility settled over him. He didn't know if he would win or if anyone would even read his story. But for now, he had taken a step toward something bigger, a step fueled by courage and the belief that maybe, just maybe, his words could make a difference. Pedro's days became a balancing act. Mornings were spent at the market, unloading crates and helping customers, while nights were reserved for writing and working with Helena. The editor had sent him detailed notes on his story, encouraging him to expand on certain themes and refine his dialogue. Her feedback was both constructive and challenging, pushing Pedro to think more critically about his craft. First, it was exhilarating. Pedro stayed up late, reworking sentences and brainstorming ideas, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. But as the weeks went on, the exhaustion began to creep in. Balancing his responsibilities at work and home with his writing left him with little time to rest. The bags under his eyes grew darker, and his focus wavered. João noticed the change during one of their lunch breaks. "You look like a zombie," João said, tossing an apple toward Pedro. "When was the last time you slept?" Pedro caught the apple with a tired grin. "I'm fine. Just a lot going on." João shook his head. "You're pushing yourself too hard, man. Don't burn out before you've even started." Pedro knew João was right, but he couldn't afford to slow down. His family depended on his income from the market, and Helena's notes demanded his attention if he wanted to grow as a writer. He felt caught between two worlds, neither of which seemed willing to give him a break. One night, after a particularly grueling shift, Pedro sat at his desk and stared at his notebook. The words wouldn't come. His mind felt foggy, and every sentence he wrote seemed worse than the last. Frustrated, he slammed the notebook shut and buried his face in his hands. Dona Marta, hearing the noise, peeked into his room. "Pedro, are you okay?" "I don't know if I can do this, May," Pedro admitted, his voice muffled. "It's too much." Dona Marta stepped inside and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've already come so far. It's okay to rest, but don't give up on something you love." Her words were gentle but firm, and Pedro felt a flicker of determination reignite. He opened the notebook again, promising himself he would take it one page at a time. As the weeks went on, Pedro found ways to manage his time more effectively. He started writing during quiet moments at the market, jotting down ideas on scraps of paper between tasks. Helena noticed his dedication and praised his progress, reminding him that every great writer faces challenges. "Writing isn't just about talent," she told him during one of their calls. "It's about persistence. You're doing the hard work, Pedro, and it's paying off." Meanwhile, Pedro's friendship with João grew strained. João had always supported Pedro's dreams, but he couldn't help feeling left behind as Pedro became more absorbed in his writing. "You're always busy now," João said one evening as they walked home from the market. "It's like you don't have time for anything else." Pedro hesitated, unsure how to respond. "I'm trying to make this work, João. It's not easy." "I get that," João said, his tone softer. "Just don't forget where you come from, okay?" Pedro nodded, but the words stayed with him. He didn't want to lose the people who had always been there for him, yet he knew he couldn't stop chasing his dream. Eventually, Pedro completed a new story, a deeply personal piece inspired by his life in the favela. It was raw, honest, and unlike anything he had written before. He shared it with Helena, who was moved by its authenticity. "This is your voice, Pedro," she said. "It's powerful. You should submit it to a larger competition." The thought terrified Pedro. What if the judges dismissed his story as they had before? But Helena's confidence in him was contagious, and he decided to take the risk. Late one night, under the same dim lamp that had illuminated his earliest stories, Pedro submitted his piece to a prestigious literary competition. As he hit submit, he felt a familiar mix of fear and hope. He didn't know what the outcome would be, but for the first time in a long while, he felt proud of his work. No matter what happened, he was determined to keep writing, one word at a time. The weeks following Pedro's submission were a mix of anxious waiting and relentless work. He tried to distract himself by focusing on his shifts at the market and fine-tuning other stories, but the thought of the competition was never far from his mind. Every time his phone buzzed, his heart raced, only to sink when it wasn't the notification he was hoping for. Then, one evening, as he prepared for dinner, his phone lit up with an email from the competition. His hands trembled as he opened it. "Congratulations, Pedro Silva. Your story has been selected as a finalist and will be featured on our platform." Pedro stared at the screen, rereading the email to make sure he wasn't imagining things. The thrill of recognition washed over him, and for the first time, it felt like his voice was finally being heard. He ran to the kitchen, where Dona Marta was stirring a pot of beans. "May, they chose my story," he exclaimed, holding up his phone. Dona Marta smiled, wiping her hands on her apron. "I always knew you had something special, Meufilio. The story was published on a prominent website the following day. Pedro's phone buzzed non-stop as messages poured in from friends, neighbors, and strangers who had read his piece. The story, a heartfelt depiction of life in the favela, struck a chord with readers. People praised its raw honesty and vivid imagery, sharing it widely on social media. Within hours it had gone viral. At the market, João greeted him with a proud grin. "You're famous now, Pedro," João said, holding up his own phone to show the dozens of comments on the story. "Everyone's talking about you." Pedro smiled, but the attention felt overwhelming. While most of the feedback was positive, he couldn't help but notice a few negative comments sprinkled among the praise. "This is just another sob story about poverty," one comment read. "He's playing the victim card to get attention." Another wrote, "He's not a real writer. He's just lucky." Pedro tried to brush off the negativity, but the words lingered in his mind. Even as he celebrated his success, a part of him wondered if he truly deserved it. The following week, Pedro was invited to a literary event in the city to discuss his story. It was an opportunity to meet established writers and gain further exposure, but it also terrified him. He didn't feel like he belonged in their world of polished professionals and formal attire. João helped him pick out a second-hand suit from a street vendor, and together they practiced answers to potential questions. Despite João's efforts to lighten the mood, Pedro couldn't shake his nerves. The event was held in a grand auditorium with high ceilings and glittering chandeliers. Pedro felt small as he stepped inside, clutching a folder with his notes. The other writers mingled confidently, their laughter echoing in the spacious hall. Pedro found a quiet corner, hoping to avoid attention until the panel began. When it was his turn to speak, Pedro took a deep breath and stepped onto the stage. The bright lights made it hard to see the audience, which was both a blessing and a curse. He introduced himself and began talking about his story, focusing on the inspiration he had drawn from his life in the favela. As he spoke, Pedro could feel the audience's attention shift. Some were genuinely engaged, while others seemed dismissive. One attendee raised a pointed question. "Do you think stories like yours can compete with more refined literature?" Pedro hesitated, his confidence faltering. But then he remembered Helena's advice. "Your voice is valid. Speak your truth." "I think stories like mine are important," Pedro replied, his voice steady. "They show a perspective that's often overlooked. Refined or not, every story deserves to be told." The room was silent for a moment, then a ripple of applause broke out. Pedro's heart swelled with relief and pride. After the event, several people approached him to express their admiration. A renowned author even offered to mentor him, praising his authenticity. But what truly moved Pedro was a message he received later that night from a young reader. "Your story gave me hope. Thank you for writing it." Pedro realized that, no matter the criticism, his words had made a difference. And for him that was enough. Pedro sat in the back seat of a crowded bus, gripping a folder filled with handwritten notes. The invitation to a prestigious literary roundtable had come a week ago, and the thought of standing among renowned authors filled him with equal parts excitement and dread. The event was a far cry from anything he had ever experienced, and doubts whispered in his mind as the bus rumbled toward the city center. When he arrived at the event venue, a grand hall adorned with ornate chandeliers and velvet curtains, Pedro felt out of place. The other attendees were dressed impeccably, their conversations filled with references to classical literature and prestigious awards. Pedro adjusted his second-hand suit, feeling the weight of every curious glance. Helena met him near the entrance, her presence a calming force. "You belong here, Pedro," she said, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Don't let anyone make you think otherwise." He nodded, trying to absorb her confidence as they entered the main hall. The room buzzed with energy, and Pedro's name was announced alongside the other panelists. Taking his seat on the stage, he scanned the audience, a sea of faces, some curious, others skeptical. The discussion began smoothly enough, with each panelist sharing their thoughts on the importance of storytelling. Pedro spoke about his experiences in the favela, emphasizing how writing had given him a voice and a sense of purpose. The audience seemed engaged, some even nodding in agreement. Then came the moment he had been dreading. Dr. Alberto, a well-known literary critic with decades of experience, leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "Pedro," he began, his tone measured, "your story has gained quite a bit of attention, but some would argue that it lacks the sophistication and depth we expect from serious literature. How do you respond to that?" Pedro's throat went dry, and for a moment, he was certain he couldn't speak. The room seemed to shrink around him, the weight of the question pressing down on his chest. But then he remembered Helena's words and Joao's unwavering belief in him. Taking a deep breath, he steadied himself. "With all due respect," Pedro began, his voice firm, "I believe literature isn't about where you come from or how refined your words sound. It's about connection, about making readers feel something real. My story may not fit traditional molds, but it reflects my truth, and I think that has value." The room fell silent, and for a moment, Pedro feared he had overstepped. But then, applause erupted from one corner of the audience, quickly spreading throughout the room. Pedro's heart swelled with relief as the noise grew louder. Dr. Alberto leaned back, his expression unreadable, but Pedro caught a flicker of acknowledgement in his eyes. The rest of the panel continued without incident, and when it ended, Pedro was approached by several attendees. A prominent editor complimented his courage, while a group of young writers expressed how inspiring his words had been. For the first time, Pedro felt like he truly belonged. Helena found him as he was gathering his things. "You were brilliant," she said with a proud smile. "Thanks to you," Pedro replied, feeling a newfound confidence. "I couldn't have done it without your guidance." That night, as Pedro rode the bus home, he replayed the event in his mind. The fear, the applause, the connections he had made. It all felt surreal. But most of all, he felt a deep sense of pride. He had faced his critics head-on and emerged stronger. Back in the favela, Joao was waiting for him at their usual spot near the market. When Pedro recounted the night's events, Joao laughed and clapped him on the back. "I always knew you'd prove them wrong." Pedro smiled, grateful for his friend's unwavering support. As he lay in bed that night, he thought about how far he had come and how much further he wanted to go. The journey was far from over, but for now he allowed himself to rest, knowing he had taken another important step toward his dreams. Pedro woke up to the familiar sounds of the favela, the chatter of neighbors, the distant hum of motorcycles, and the cries of street vendors peddling their goods. But today those sounds felt different. After the whirlwind of the literary roundtable, Pedro felt a pull to reconnect with the place that had shaped him, the place his stories were born from. He spent the morning walking through the alleys, greeting familiar faces and soaking in the vibrant life around him. The graffiti on the walls, the smell of freshly baked bread from Dona Zilda's bakery, and the laughter of children playing football in the streets all served as reminders of his roots. When Pedro stopped by his old school, he was greeted by the principal, Senor Amaral, who beamed with pride. "Pedro, we've all been following your success," he said. "The students would love to hear from you. Would you speak to them?" Pedro hesitated. The idea of addressing a room full of kids felt daunting, but he couldn't say no to the man who had once encouraged him to write essays for the school newspaper. "I'd be honored," he finally said. Later that day, Pedro stood in front of a classroom packed with eager faces. The students ranged in age, some clutching notebooks, others simply curious to see the man who had come from their neighborhood and made a name for himself. "I started just like you," Pedro began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "Sitting in this classroom, dreaming of something bigger but not knowing how to get there." He told them about his struggles, the late nights spent writing by lamplight, and the doubts that had threatened to derail him. He also shared the triumphs, the first story he submitted, the challenges he overcame, and the moments when his words found their audience. "Writing isn't easy," he said, looking around the room. But if there's something you love, something that makes you feel alive, don't let go of it. Your dreams are valid, no matter where you come from. As the students applauded, Pedro felt a surge of gratitude. He saw himself in their wide-eyed expressions and realized that his journey wasn't just about his success. It was about paving the way for others to dream beyond their circumstances. That evening, Pedro returned home and sat at his desk. His notebook, worn and filled with countless stories, was open in front of him. Inspired by the day, he began writing a new piece, a story that wove together the colors, sounds, and resilience of the favela. It was a love letter to the community that had shaped him. When Helena read the draft a few days later, she was moved. "This is your best work yet," she said. "It's authentic, powerful. You need to share it." Encouraged by her words, Pedro decided to submit the piece to a prominent literary magazine. As he hit submit, he felt a sense of peace. No matter the outcome, he was proud of what he had created. But Pedro's ambitions didn't stop there. With some of the money he had earned from his recent success, he began laying the groundwork for a project close to his heart, a community center dedicated to storytelling. He envisioned a space where kids from the favela could learn to write, read, and share their voices with the world. When Pedro shared the idea with João, his friend's eyes lit up. "That's amazing, Pedro. Count me in." Together, they began planning, reaching out to neighbors and friends for support. The center would be a place where stories were celebrated, where kids like Pedro could discover their potential. As the days passed, Pedro felt a renewed sense of purpose. His journey had brought him back to where it all began, but this time, he was determined to bring others along with him. The grand opening of Pedro's Community Storytelling Center was a day filled with excitement and pride. Neighbors gathered in the small, brightly painted building at the heart of the favela. Colorful banners hung above the entrance, and children darted in and out, their laughter filling the air. Pedro stood by the door, welcoming each visitor with a warm smile. The center, named Voces de Favela, Voices of the Favela, was a dream made real. Inside, the walls were adorned with bookshelves overflowing with donated books, and a few tables and chairs were arranged for workshops and discussions. A mural painted by local artists depicted a scene of resilience and hope, a tribute to the community's spirit. As the crowd settled in, Pedro stepped to the front of the room. His heart raced, but as he looked at the faces before him, friends, family, and neighbors, he felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice steady. "This center isn't just about me. It's about us. It's about the stories we carry and the voices that deserve to be heard." The crowd erupted into applause, and Pedro felt a lump form in his throat. He shared the vision behind Voces de Favela, a space where children and adults alike could learn to write, read, and express themselves freely. A place where dreams could take root and flourish. João, who had helped Pedro every step of the way, joined him at the front. "Pedro's story inspired me," João said, addressing the crowd. "And now, this place will inspire so many others." Among the attendees was Helena, who had traveled from the city to support Pedro on this special day. She couldn't hide her pride as she watched him speak with confidence and passion. The highlight of the event was the first workshop, where Pedro sat with a group of children, guiding them through the basics of storytelling. He encouraged them to share their ideas, no matter how big or small. One boy hesitantly raised his hand, sharing a story about his dream of flying above the city and seeing the world. Pedro listened intently, smiling as the boy's confidence grew. "That's a story worth telling," Pedro said, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "And I can't wait to see how you write it." As the day wound down, Pedro found himself reflecting on how far he had come. The boy who once scribbled in a tattered notebook by lamplight had created something far greater than himself. His stories had given him a voice, but this center would amplify the voices of an entire community. That evening, Pedro sat at his desk, surrounded by the hum of the neighborhood. He opened a fresh notebook, its blank pages brimming with possibility. His new project, a novel inspired by the journeys of those in the favela, had been taking shape in his mind for weeks. Now he was ready to bring it to life. As he began to write, he felt a sense of fulfillment he hadn't known before. His words were no longer just a way to escape. They were a way to give back, to honor the place and people who had shaped him. The lights of the favela twinkled outside his window as Pedro wrote late into the night, driven by a deep sense of purpose. He knew that the road ahead would have its challenges, but for the first time he felt certain of his path. And so, Pedro's story continued, not as a lone journey, but as a shared legacy, one built on resilience, creativity, and the unshakable belief that every voice matters. Do you believe that where we come from defines where we can go? Pedro's story shows us the power of resilience and how even the humblest dreams can inspire change when nurtured with courage and authenticity. What would you do if the world doubted your potential? Would you keep fighting to be heard? Click on the video on your screen now to dive deeper into this inspiring journey of self-discovery and perseverance. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories that challenge the way we see ourselves and the world around us. Let's keep exploring these powerful narratives together.